Luis, who is an economic consultant, Miriam Celaya from 14 José Luis Perelló is in absentia, so I will present on his behalf. He's a professor of tourism at the University of Havana, and discussing will be Ted Henkin of Baruch College in New York, and Gary Maybarduk, retired from the Department of State. So what we're going to do is we're going to each present for about 15 to 18 minutes, and then, more or less, broadly speaking, and then we will have the discussants chime in, and then we will take questions and wrap it up. So thank you very much, and I present to you Ernesto.
Thank you very much. Recently, I wrote a paper on the economic policies that Cuba should pursue in preparation for a possible elimination of the Helms-Burton law by the Congress of the United States. The paper was discussed at a conference in Puerto Rico that was attended by both Cuban-American economists and economists from the island, where we had I must say, very civilized dialogue. I will not repeat my suggestions here. There are copies of the paper around, and I'll be glad to send you one if you wish. But rather, what I would like to do is to summarize the main points that came out of the discussion in San Juan and in other venues later on, at Rutgers and in other places. I will touch briefly on 4 points: foreign trade, exchange rate reform, access to international organizations, and macroeconomic policy. Beginning with foreign trade, I was a little bit disappointed by some of the reactions to my suggestion, which was that trying to pick the winners was a sure way to create distortions, encourage corruption, and end up picking losers. My view was, and remains, that Cuban producers should be allowed to develop their own comparative advantage. But I was told that the outlook for exports of services and education, for example, was particularly bright and was worthy, and this is what scares me a little bit, worthy of state support. Now, this may be true. I'm not sure it is. So far, Cuba has supplied the services of education, of teachers as part of barter-type arrangements with Venezuela and other satellite countries. But it is not clear at all that these services would be purchased freely by trading partners on a purely commercial basis. I don't deny that Cuba could develop a comparative advantage in professional services like health, possibly some aspects of education, and certainly sports. But the government should go about this by authorizing the creation of private enterprises that would coordinate operations between Cuban professionals or athletes and foreigners interested in acquiring their talents, helping them to negotiate both prices and quantities at their own risk and to their own benefit. This would ensure 2 things. First of all, that Cuba would not be subject to a shock if the partners to the barter arrangement were to declare that the deal has been canceled. Of course, I'm thinking of Venezuela now. Second, that Cuban professionals sent abroad would be paid a fair wage. And I will talk about that later a little bit. So if the Cuban government wants to help its exporters, it should forget about subsidies and instead eliminate the state monopoly on trade, provide a stable macroeconomic environment, and speed up exchange rate reform. And I'm coming now to this particular topic, which I consider of fundamental importance right now. There was quasi-unanimity in San Juan and other places that the unification and liberalization of the exchange rate system could make a very important contribution to efficiency and to the integration of Cuba in world markets. Some of our colleagues from the island explained that the ongoing process was going to be gradual and that it was taking place at differential speeds depending on the various sectors of the economy. Others were more impatient, and some believed, as I do, that the process had stalled. Now, why the slowness of exchange rate reform? It undoubtedly reflects opposition to liberalization in various corners of the economy, some of them ideological, some of them coming from those elements who stand to lose a lot of money from the elimination of the huge gap between the exchange rate that applies to enterprises and the exchange rate that applies to the population. But also, there is a fear, a diffuse fear, that the future devaluation of the peso will necessarily create chaos, and in particular would generate hyperinflation. Now, that fear is unfounded. It will not, what it will create is a change, perhaps very large in relative prices. That's a once-and-for-all effect. It's not an ongoing, continuous inflationary process, unless, of course, it is validated by a loose monetary policy. Finally, I believe that the fear that the devaluation will bring about the end of the world is exaggerated. Countries in Eastern and Central Europe and the Baltic countries in Vietnam have gone through a similar process without apparently disappearing from the map. In any case, the devaluation of the non-convertible peso must occur and will occur whether we like it or not. There's no way that system will be sustainable once the exchange market is liberalized. There will be a large change in relative practices affecting enterprises, some of them considerably, but this is exactly what the doctor ordered, namely that some enterprises will flourish as a result of this change, and others will have to adjust or disappear. In a paper presented last year at this conference by Augusto de la Torre and Alain Ease, they proposed the use of subsidies to minimize the damage that could result from the devaluation for certain enterprises. I am very worried about that suggestion, and I hope it's not taken seriously in Cuba. First of all, it will demolish the valiant efforts made since the end of Soviet subsidies in '89 and '90 of bringing down the massive subsidies that the Cuban state was given. This was an important effort that should not be compromised. And second, because I believe that when you talk about temporary subsidies, these temporary subsidies have a way of becoming permanent because there are some powerful interests created. Let me go now to the next topic, which is joining the International Financial Organization. Most of my colleagues, independently of residence, thought that joining the bank and the fund, once Helms-Burton is eliminated, would be good for Cuba. The question was, what, if anything, can be done in the meantime? Because, as you know, Helms-Burton prohibits the United States from the executive branch from supporting the admission of Cuba in the fund. Well, some people said, well, what you can do is you can modernize Cuba's prehistoric financial system. That would be a good preparation for that. It can also begin, and this was also a general view, begin seriously preparing a reasonable set of financial and economic statistics, and this not only because the IMF will require it, but also for the good of Cuba and its own policymakers. Finally, there was a suggestion made by Pavel Vidal and Scott Brown in a recent outstanding book on this subject, which I recommend very strongly, that Cuba could, without immediately facing the question of admission, could begin to negotiate training and technical assistance programs with the fund and the bank, and perhaps even other international organizations. I think that's a great example. I think it is politically and legally feasible, and I think it should be explored as soon as possible. The second option that these two gentlemen discuss is that Cuba should ask a country such as Brazil, a friendly country that is a member of the fund, to present the membership of Cuba in the fund. I think that's a dangerous strategy if it is done without the approval of the United States. A number of countries would vote against. The United States, with its major, important weighted vote, and the board of the fund would may be compelled to vote against. And it would put Japan, Canada, and the Western European countries in a diplomatically impossible situation of either betraying their North American ally or refusing Cuban admission in the fund. Let me finish with macroeconomic policy. A recent slowdown of economic growth in Cuba has been attributed by some, both in Miami and in Havana, by the way, to the insufficiency of reforms and to excessive fiscal stringency imposed by Raúl Castro's administration since 2008. I disagree. First, because the actions taken on the structural front, and particularly the mass transfer of manpower from the state to the private sector, will, I think, yield important benefits in the medium to long run, but you cannot expect them to have an immediate positive effect on growth. Second, because the expenditure cuts implemented from 2009 to 2012 were an indispensable part of the required adjustment to the spending spree of the mid-2000s, a spree that culminated in the crisis of 2008, where the external environment took an unfortunate, unfavorable turn. Continued fiscal extravagance, I am convinced, would have aggravated the balance of payments crisis and banking crisis in Cuba, intensified already severe payments difficulties, and seriously compromised the reputation of Cuba in world financial market. So I think that fiscal correction introduced by the government was absolutely necessary. Where do we go from here? Well, Cuba has fueled growth since the end of Soviet subsidies by utilizing its labor force more and more intensely, and the reduction in hidden unemployment was a large part of that. That's fine, but that game has an end. And the end, I think, will be coming relatively soon. At one point, you cannot continue to fuel growth by stimulating demand and using resources more effectively. You will have to do it by increasing investment and by taking additional productivity-enhancing structural measures. But this cannot be only clowns and hairdressers. It will have to be much more far-reaching, and I think it will unavoidably have to involve sectors that up to now have been considered taboo for the private sector, such as education and health. I would like to end with a fervent appeal to the government to end what constitutes an unjust form of mistreatment of Cuban workers, and Emilio referred to that this morning. The government gets paid in dollars for the services of Cubans working in foreign companies and some that are exported abroad, and it pays them in pesos, imposing a huge confiscatory tax. I think this practice should be discontinued, not only to get Cuba in good standing with the International Labor Office and the World Workers Movement, but also so that Cuban officials can look at themselves in the mirror and not feel ashamed of themselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ernesto. Next up is Luis, presenting the economic consequences of Cuba and U.S. reconciliation. Do you have your computer?
I think
Yes, just press that button there.
Right.
Should be going on, yeah.
It's not projecting.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Will.
15.
Okay. I am a little bit ambitious on this topic. The actual results are not going to be that surprising. But what I'm trying to do is to look at two different segments of the reconciliation process. One, which is not as difficult, and it is to look at the impact of the measures already taken. So we have some knowledge of what President Obama did and announced and put into effect in December of last year. And the second part is to look at a longer-term horizon of what the Cuban economy could potentially do over the long term if there is full reconciliation. In other words, if there is complete opening. But I'm not getting into the question of how to get there, because that is really difficult and complicated. But we can then take it as given somehow without knowing the exact timing of it. So in this paper, I then look at the short-term impact of what's going on, in other words, of the measures already taken, and then a longer-term horizon, which I look by essentially the dynamics, the long-term dynamics of the Cuban economy. And then finally, I take a look at what reconciliation means for Cuban economic policy in terms of incentives for changing policy. And some things there are fairly clear. Now, there are essentially some elements to the current measures, and I estimate the 1 year positive impact of these measures around something like about 0.5% of Cuba's GDP. And I'll get into the details a little bit later. But the main important question here is that regardless of these measures, Cuba needs to make changes in economic policies to accompany these changes. Now, in the short term, this is not as critical, and I can look at the elements in the short-term effect. So the short-term impact, there are several key elements. One is the most important element are remittances. Remittances are the most important element in the economic relation between the U.S. and Cuban residents. And we don't really know the precise amount of these remittances. There are two sets of estimates. One is made by the Habana Consulting Group, which estimated them around $2,000, at about 770 million for 2014. 2.5 billion for 2014. And the second estimate is from Orozco, which estimates it at 770 million for 2014. So there's a wide gap as to what these remittances are.
And this has to do with survey methods. They're both based on surveys, but the difference is substantial. So I use both of them and calculate that the trend over the long term has been around 12% per year increase, and I use that continuation. Now, there's an element that had a limit. The new measures of Obama increased the limit to $8,000 per year per person, and according to the estimates by the Habana Consulting Group, the remittances were about $2,000 per person. So the limit here seemed to have been perhaps effective in some cases. So by lifting the limit, one would increase remittances. The second element in the short term are U.S. visitors. We don't know the exact number for 2014. In 2013, the number was around 93,000 non-Cuban U.S. visitors. In 2014, I'm using 95,000. Some people think it's closer to 100,000. We don't know for sure. But we know there is going to be a very large increase this year simply because the transportation capacity has increased already quite substantially. So for purposes of, and these are very, very rough numbers, we think that the number may be perhaps 200,000 or something in that magnitude for this year, and again would increase by a significantly sizable amount next year, so that the bottom line is that I estimate the amount non-Cuban U.S. visitors spent about $90 million in 2014, and that may increase to about over 200 million this year. So the effect of all these figures, using the middle point in the remittances, now some of these remittances are for investment purposes, and this actually may be some of the reason why the surveys produce such a wide-ranging set of numbers. And, but the overall impact of all of this is about 0.5%, roughly, very roughly about 0.5% of Cuba's GDP. So it's not a huge amount, but Cuba's economy grew only 1.3% last year. So in relation to the dynamics of Cuba, the 0.5% is interesting. Now, the other element are U.S. exports. U.S. exports to Cuba have been declining. Even in this year, the numbers we have for the first 4 months implied again a decrease, so that exports peaked around 2008 and then declined. The reason is essentially competition, that Cuba is getting financing for agricultural foodstuffs from Brazil and Vietnam, where they buy rice, and other countries, and essentially that's why there's been a displacement of the U.S. market by other food producers, which is the main Cuban import where the U.S. has been competing. So now what I do here is that I assume that financing is not going to change radically, but there is going to be more cash flow from the U.S., and I assume some of these will be essentially used to increase U.S. purchases. So I don't think there'll be any significant change in the trend for this year, but for next year, we will have an increase of U.S. exports, but still will be well below the peak year. So by 2016, we may get a rough number of 100 million. Now, what about the long-term horizon? And the long-term horizon, essentially, here we assume that somehow sanctions and laws and legal problems between Cuba and the U.S. are resolved. Of course, these are quite complex and very difficult. I used to work for an English bank in London in 1987 when the Chinese, People's Republic of China was our client, and they wanted to issue a bond. Well, before they could issue a bond, they had to do all kinds of legal work and also repay some of the defaulted bonds for 1948. And this was very complex. And China's debt was very simple because essentially they had issued a handful of bonds in the London market, and it was far simpler than the Cuban situation, but yet was a complicated process. Now, in the Cuban case, there are not only then the legal aspects in terms of U.S. law, but also the claims that have been adjudicated by courts and so forth, which essentially makes things very difficult. And I'm not getting into the process by which this can be cleared, which is going to be quite complex. But for instance, the idea of a U.S. tourist using credit cards in Cuba, it isn't going to happen soon because essentially those credit cards generate a flow that is essentially has to go from the U.S. to Cuba to pay for those expenditures, and those flows can be intercepted. Essentially, they're court claims against these things. So this has to be resolved. But in any case, I am using the economist's excuse that this will essentially be clear somehow. So what happens in the long term? Well, my critical point is that you have to look at reforms in Cuba. And now Raul Castro has said he doesn't want to install a capitalist economy. He's not getting back to capitalism. But we know that markets, when they are regulated properly, provide efficient resource allocation. And essentially, it's a good criteria. Now, I look at the European Bank and Reconstruction and Development criteria for reforms. Now, again, Cuba, we know they say they're not going there. But what these criteria are, essentially, is a way to measure how much progress has been made in making markets work, if you want. And by that, they look at 5 key criteria. The first column, Cuba is the first set here. I compare it with other countries in the European Bank Reconstruction and Development sample. The first is large-scale privatization. The first column, Cuba has done nothing on large-scale privatization. The second one, small-scale privatization, Cuba has done essentially the movement towards the cuentapropistas. The third is enterprise governance. Cuba hasn't done very much. The fourth is LIB liberalization of prices, and then trade regulations and competition policy. Well, I compared Cuba to all the sample in the US, in the EBRD universe, and Turkmenistan is at the bottom of the list. It's the last country. And it's the one that ranks lowest in the 33 countries where transitions are taking place to a market economy, and Cuba is below Turkmenistan. Now, I attempted to look at China because I don't really know too much about China, and it would be, so I'm running out of time, but I haven't gotten to the long term. What I've done is I look at a long-term simulation to get potential growth paths of the Cuban economy using a model of the economy. And now this is the maximum growth that could take place given the structural conditions of the Cuban economy. So it's not a forecast. And we have a base case that because of reconciliation, there'll be some increase in foreign investment, but the same domestic savings that are very low now. And Cuba has a maximum growth path of 4% per year, simulated over the long term. Now, in year 5, this model, the dynamics of the Cuban economy imply that growth can only come from a shift, as Ernesto mentioned this, from the state sector to the private sector. Because, well, the labor force is stagnant, there is no demographic growth in Cuba, so the dynamics have to imply this shift from the state sector to the private sector. Now, if there is more of a foreign investment, then the growth path goes to around 5%. Foreign investment goes to 3%. Foreign investment now in Cuba is less than 1% of GDP. We don't know the exact number, but it's at best around 1%. Now, if there is moderate privatization, and the moderate privatization implies that essentially the Cubans begin privatizing medium-sized enterprises, for instance. And that implies that foreign investment will continue, and also it implies that the state sector savings may contribute, may increase. That increases growth somewhat more to about 5.5%. And then by year 5, the private sector will be about 35% of the economy. The private sector now measured by us is around 24%. And that includes, if you put as part of the private sector, the foreign investment in nickel, for instance, that's managed by foreign companies. And it also includes the cuentapropistas, but does not include cooperatives. Now, mass privatization would imply that the government essentially shifts 15% of its labor force to the private sector, or allows it every year. That means the potential growth will be about 6%. And by year 5, about half the economy would be private, defined in the way that I mentioned. Now, I then talk about what are the prospects for economic policy. Will the government continue to control the pace of market reform? So well, we don't know, obviously. That's beyond the task of economists. But we know that the US demand for Cuban services and goods require capacity expansion. And given the low savings rate in Cuba, that has to be complemented by foreign investment. And the same, access to the US market requires more competitive Cuban firms. Now, all of this, and I think Ernesto mentioned this, will require a substantial financial sector overhaul in Cuba. Conclusions, the short-term impact, we know it's roughly around 0.5%. It's not going to solve Cuba's problems with the current measures. The long-term effects will depend on Cuban economic reform. So it's not only a question of the US opening up, but what will the Cubans do? The potential growth path could go up to, let's say, 5.5%. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to get there. And one of the things is that the Cubans do roughly the same calculations. They are very smart, as I am. And they calculate that growth is around 4%. But the problem is getting there is difficult because they don't have the allocation of resources is quite inefficient. And there are many, many problems. So they don't get to the potential growth path. They essentially are well below that potential growth path. Determined privatization would help. Reconciliation offers clear incentives, though opposition remains strong, apparently, among the Cuban leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. All right, next is Miriam Celaya, who will present Cuba's, Relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos, razones para el optimismo.
Sí, yo voy a pedir por favor quedarme acá sentada para consultar desde la máquina. Y
¿No
más
necesita
bien,
el PowerPoint?
no me va a ser necesario porque realmente confieso que no me dio tiempo de terminarlo, pero es muy básico lo que yo voy a exponer acá.
Muy
no
bien.
me parece que sea complejo entenderlo.
Adelante, 18.
También voy a decir que voy a exponer en español porque realmente mi inglés paupérrimo no me permitiría entenderme ni yo misma. Pido también si me van a hacer alguna pregunta que me la hagan en español en su momento. Estoy muy complacida de estar aquí. Yo soy columnista del periódico 14 y medio, dirigido por Joanny Sánchez. Y básicamente estos eventos me sirven, además de para exponer ideas que se basan en las experiencias tomadas por una periodista ciudadana a ras del suelo desde la población cubana. No soy una economista, no soy una experta en relaciones económicas, muchísimo menos en relaciones internacionales, pero sí en relaciones humanas con los cubanos con los que convivo. Yo vivo en La Habana, en un municipio muy populoso que se llama Centro Habana y donde la gente suele ser abierta y comunicativa, sobre todo cuando los periodistas somos de allá, somos los suyos, somos los que estamos cerca y los que tenemos las mismas vivencias. Entonces, no pido condescendencia, quiero que sean implacables, quiero que sean bien malos, que me hagan las preguntas más difíciles que les parezcan, si así les interesa, pero que no esperen tampoco un trabajo académico propiamente, aunque sí utilizo datos que se ofrecen por parte del gobierno a partir de las reuniones de los consejos de ministros, que es el método de gobierno que ha estado utilizando el estilo de gobierno del general presidente Raúl Castro. Y claro que los datos estadísticos de los anuarios de la Oficina Nacional de Estadísticas e Información, que es son los datos oficiales. Me baso para este trabajo, es más bien un conjunto de reflexiones en torno a un fenómeno que se viene suscitando en la prensa y que yo aprecio cada vez que exploro navego a través de las webs. Y es que se está como creando por parte de algunos medios, lamentablemente a veces son grandes medios, de mucho público, de muchos lectores, se está creando una especie de expectativa sobre que en Cuba se están produciendo cambios, se están magnificando los cambios que se están produciendo hacia el interior de Cuba. Y yo creo que esto es un peligro y me parece también que es necesario ponderar la importancia que se le da a esos cambios. Lo digo porque he tenido experiencia en otros eventos. En octubre tuve la dicha de participar en un evento que se dio en la Universidad de Columbia, en la Facultad de Periodismo, invitada por acá mi amigo, el académico Ted Henken, y me sentí muy privilegiada de estar allí, pero esto fue previo, como se sabe, a que se produjera el anuncio del restablecimiento de relaciones entre los gobiernos de Cuba y Estados Unidos. Y a mí me maravilló la expectativa que había allí, la percepción que había acerca de lo que es el embargo, y no del embargo, su levantamiento. Yo en lo personal soy favorable al levantamiento del embargo, sino la historia que se tejía en torno a aquello, o sea, las bases por qué había que derogar el embargo. Yo sí creo que era importante derogarlo, pero no por las bases que se sostenían allí en aquel evento. Y fue muy interesante el intercambio. Creo que aquí pudiera ser otra oportunidad de ver lo mismo. Realmente, las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, mi título es Razones para el optimismo. O sea, este optimismo se fundamenta. ¿En qué se fundamenta, no? El optimismo, que estoy viendo sobre todo en los medios, repito. Yo prefiero hacer una lectura bastante rápida, mi trabajo no es tan extenso, porque me parece que aquí voy a ser más coherente que si me pongo simplemente a conversar con ustedes. Entonces, empezaría por la introducción, no por el resumen. Bueno, desde que en diciembre último se anunciara oficialmente el restablecimiento de relaciones entre los gobiernos de Cuba y Estados Unidos, todo cuanto acontece en torno a la economía, la sociedad y la política cubanas parece estar sujeto a la agenda de diálogos que han estado sosteniendo ambas partes. Tengo que puntualizar que todo este debate sobre economía, política cubana, sociedad y demás se produce en la prensa, pero no hacia el interior de Cuba. Hacia el interior de Cuba son los mínimos resúmenes de los diálogos, de los encuentros entre los representantes de los funcionarios de ambos gobiernos y los ordenos y mandos habituales de los consejos de ministros o de la prensa oficial. En franca contradicción con la muy cacareada soberanía nacional, tanto los medios de prensa de la isla, monopolio del gobierno, como expertos diletantes del tema cubano de las más diversas especialidades han estado centrando la atención en los pasos que viene dando Washington en el proceso de deshielo, como si de ello dependiera esencialmente la necesaria transformación que debería producirse al interior de Cuba, y al gobierno del general presidente Raúl Castro le correspondiera apenas la pasiva función de abrir los cerrojos de la isla para, una vez liquidado el embargo estadounidense, dar amplia entrada en Cuba a la inversión extranjera, la única permitida. Se sabe que los cubanos no pueden invertir. Manteniendo a la vez, aunque sea en precario estado vegetativo, las pseudo-reformas de utilería que permiten a los observadores más complacientes afirmar la existencia de una creciente clase media y una voluntad gubernamental de cambios. La enorme influencia que históricamente han tenido sobre Cuba las relaciones con su poderoso vecino se revela ahora transformada en una coyuntura, donde finalmente han confluido, por una parte, los intereses políticos de una casta militar asida al poder en Cuba, para lo cual necesita la inyección del robusto capital estadounidense, y por otra, los intereses de ese propio capital que apuntalarían lo que eventualmente también constituiría en cierta medida una inversión regional para Estados Unidos en el plano político. He aquí que ha primado el sentido común por sobre la tosudez, las finanzas por sobre las ideologías. Pero mientras el gobierno estadounidense democráticamente electo representa en ese acto la garantía de los derechos e intereses de sus ciudadanos, el poder militar cubano margina y excluye a los ciudadanos de la isla de la participación y los beneficios del nuevo escenario. Lo cual, por supuesto, no es en absoluto de la competencia del gobierno estadounidense, al que en última instancia conviene igualmente un clima de distensión y estabilidad en la isla. Es ese juego de intereses lo que motiva a los sectores más influyentes de la opinión pública en la magnificación de la agenda de reconciliación en torno al diferendo de medio siglo y en los pasos que ha dado la administración estadounidense como columna vertebral de los cambios al interior de Cuba. En particular, se ha hecho énfasis en el levantamiento del embargo como requisito imprescindible para la solución del estancamiento económico interno de la isla, omitiendo que las verdaderas raíces de la crisis estriban en la demostrada incapacidad del modelo impuesto por el poder de la élite militar perpetuada en el poder político y en el freno, y en el freno que ésta aplica al desarrollo, al impedir el pleno ejercicio de los derechos ciudadanos, incluyendo los derechos económicos. En este nuevo contexto, las negociaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos y a tenor con las llamadas reformas raulistas, sí, que han permitido el surgimiento de un raquítico sector relativamente autónomo, trabajadores por cuenta propia, no faltan economistas y otros expertos que comienzan a hablar del inicio de un progresivo camino de la isla hacia el libre mercado que se irá consolidando a medida que se avance en la normalización de las relaciones con Estados Unidos. Como para reforzar esto, las estadísticas oficiales acaban de revelar en el pasado mes de junio de 2015 que el sector cuentapropista ha crecido hasta alcanzar la cifra de 500.000, casi un 40% de crecimiento en comparación con el total de 357.663 que existían entre julio y agosto de 2011, según datos de una encuesta realizada por la UNED y divulgada entonces por el Consejo de Ministros. En realidad, el nuevo escenario de los vínculos con Estados Unidos solo será promisorio para los cubanos en la medida, estoy cortando porque el tiempo apremia y no podré tocar todas las ideas del trabajo. Bueno, en realidad el nuevo escenario de vínculos con Estados Unidos solo será promisorio para los cubanos en la medida en que cuenten con las libertades económicas, políticas y sociales que les permitan desempeñarse como actores de las transformaciones y no como simples espectadores de las maniobras del poder en pos de salvaguardar sus propios intereses. Hay una veleidad en las estadísticas. Pese a tan promisorias estadísticas oficiales que sugieren un auge en el trabajo por cuenta propia, en realidad no se ha producido un despegue efectivo en el sector. En esas cifras están incluidos, cuando se habla de 500.000, de 500.000 de cuentapropistas, ahí se están incluyendo vendedores de durofrío, rellenadores de fosforera, manicuri y una serie de trabajos que ni son productivos ni realmente significan un desarrollo en el sector, ¿no? Un desarrollo en calidad ni en productividad mucho menos, ¿no? Cada año son devueltas además gran cantidad de licencias. Ese número no se refleja nunca en el anuario de la UNED. ¿Cuántas licencias se devuelven? Porque además es un sector muy inestable. Muchas personas entregan licencias, otras piden licencias para desencantarse poco tiempo después o asfixiarse y volverlas a entregar. Y entonces eso es lo que ha estado ocurriendo básicamente. Transcurrido un lustro de experimentos, más tiempo del que dispone un presidente estadounidense para cumplir con su electorado, las reformas del pragmático general presidente cubano no arrojan los resultados esperados. La crisis prevalece, no se aprecian beneficios palpables en los ingresos familiares y muchos de los llamados emprendedores se mantienen a flote en un equilibrio precario entre el cumplimiento de los numerosos impuestos, los sobornos a inspectores y policías y los riesgos que implica apelar al comercio ilícito como alternativa ante la falta de un mercado mayorista. Informes oficiales apuntan que hasta finales de 2014 estaban funcionando, por ejemplo, 347 cooperativas de un total de 498 autorizadas a crearse. Al cierre del pasado mes de noviembre, 268 de ellas habían aportado 87.727 millones de pesos por concepto de impuestos sobre ventas y utilidades, así como la correspondiente contribución a la seguridad social. Al cierre del año, los sectores de comercio, gastronomía y servicios técnicos y personales constituían el 88% de las cooperativas no agropecuarias, seguidos por los de la construcción y la industria. Más del 70% de estas entidades se ubicaban en las provincias de La Habana, Artemisa y Matanzas, Occidente fundamentalmente, y en la actualidad se estudia la aprobación de 205 nuevas propuestas. Sin embargo, a pesar de que según el informe sobre gestión de las cooperativas no agropecuarias, elaborado por la Comisión Permanente para la Implementación y Desarrollo. Todos estos son datos oficiales, repito. Estas tienen buenos resultados productivos, económicos y financieros, son fuentes de empleo, contribuyen al incremento de ofertas y la calidad de producciones y servicios y prevalece en ellas la disciplina tributaria, como confirma la Oficina Nacional de la Administración Tributaria, ONAT, durante el más reciente Consejo de Ministros, que fue el 29 de mayo de 2015. El general presidente llamó a no masificar la creación de cooperativas y señaló que la prioridad deberá ser consolidar las que existen e ir avanzando en forma gradual para no generalizar los problemas que se presentan. Por su parte, Marino Murillo, jefe de la Comisión Permanente, señaló que existen también aspectos negativos como la carga burocrática, los precios, la tendencia a incrementar los precios, especialmente en los mercados agropecuarios y los servicios gastronómicos. No obstante, en el marco del propio Consejo de Ministros fueron aprobadas varias medidas para favorecer esa forma de gestión cooperativa. Se dice que hay que esperar, hay que seguir esperando. Es decir, que a contrapelo de las estadísticas que sugieren un auge en el sector por cuenta propia, en la realidad no se constata progresión. Algunas actividades que alcanzaron cierto apogeo hasta el año 2013 en la actualidad se han contraído o desaparecido. Además de los elevados impuestos por múltiples conceptos, los excesivos controles, incluido todo un ejército de inspectores corruptos, de la ausencia del mercado mayorista y desabastecimiento crónico del minorista, en monopolio del Estado, por cierto, existe la incertidumbre legal de los protoempresarios nacionales debido tanto a la inexistencia de un cuerpo de normas jurídicas que protejan sus inversiones, incluyendo el reconocimiento de derechos tan elementales como la libertad de asociación. Por ejemplo, en los últimos meses se aprecia un incremento del número de cuentapropistas dedicados a la venta de tarjetas para recarga de teléfonos celulares. Ese ha cogido mucho auge últimamente a partir del establecimiento de redes Wi-Fi públicas en Cuba que ya han empezado a funcionar. Pero bueno, esto prácticamente son casi empleados del gobierno, porque son vendedores de tarjetas que son las mismas que vende la red de telecomunicaciones oficiales Texas. Es decir, lo que en un principio se suponían reformas, hacer productiva una economía nacional largamente estancada, desembarazar al Estado del exceso de prestaciones sociales y subsidios, abrir posibilidades de nuevas fuentes de empleo capaces de absorber la fuerza laboral que quedaría excedente, como se llama allí a los despidos, entre los ciudadanos, especialmente a fomentar una nueva mentalidad entre los ciudadanos que los impulsara a depender cada vez menos de las gratuidades y subsidios y asumir plenamente la responsabilidad de tributar impuestos al Estado. Este proceso, en ese sentido, hasta el momento ha fracasado, porque simplemente la mentalidad de la autocracia verde olivo es la que se niega a cambiar. La apertura estadounidense contra el cerrojo cubano, ya veo que no voy a tener tiempo. Ay, perdón. Bueno, apenas semanas después de anunciado el restablecimiento de relaciones por los gobiernos de Cuba y Estados Unidos, el presidente estadounidense dictó un paquete de medidas que flexibilizaban más aún el embargo, destinadas a favorecer el empoderamiento de la sociedad civil cubana. Las medidas incluían desde cuestiones relativas al comercio, importación de artículos y medios productivos de Estados Unidos hasta el apoyo a empresarios no estatales. Sin embargo, esos pasos de Washington no han encontrado respuesta en la contraparte cubana. El gobierno de la isla no solo se mantiene refractario a dictar resoluciones que permitan la participación directa de los cubanos en la economía, sino que por el contrario ha dictado leyes que los exceptúan o que los coartan expresamente en estas y otras libertades. Tales son los casos de la Ley para la Inversión Extranjera, que excluye cualquier posibilidad de inversión por parte de los nacionales en su propio país. El nuevo Código Laboral, que no reconoce conquistas democráticas tan elementales y legítimas como el de libre sindicalización, derecho a huelga y a la libre contratación, así como que ha reforzado las disposiciones aduanales que limitan al extremo las posibilidades de importación de los cubanos, sin contar con los elevados aranceles que se imponen a los productos permitidos. En cambio, dictó leyes que flexibilizan los aranceles de las empresas extranjeras que vayan a invertir en Cuba. En tales condiciones, la idea de que las nuevas relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos o el levantamiento del embargo por sí solos resulten promisorios para la prosperidad y las libertades de los cubanos no pasa de ser una quimera. Hasta el momento, toda posibilidad aperturista en Cuba, sea en materia de economía como de conquistas sociales y políticas, ha chocado contra el valladar de prohibiciones que levantan las autoridades gubernamentales. Una situación que no van a salvar ni la avalancha de turistas estadounidenses, ni la apertura de nuevos restaurantes, hospedajes y timbiriches. Recientemente se ha hablado de economía en eventos, he estado leyendo y me parece que hay también esa visión, ¿no? De, bueno, el general presidente está avanzando en las reformas. Yo creo que las reformas en principio son buenas, pero que deben tener mayor calado, deben profundizarse más y otorgar más libertades. Es innegable que el clima de distensión que se está construyendo a partir del restablecimiento de relaciones y el proceso de diálogo entre los gobiernos de Cuba y Estados Unidos crea un escenario favorable para eventuales transformaciones al interior de Cuba. A esto también contribuiría el levantamiento del embargo y las medidas de flexibilización que hasta el momento ha dictado Washington y que no han recibido la correspondiente respuesta por parte del gobierno cubano. Sin embargo, si bien hay ciertas razones para el optimismo, estas deben ser muy moderadas. El nuevo escenario podría no ser necesariamente favorable a las libertades de los cubanos. Mucho menos implica en sí mismo el inicio de un proceso de democratización al interior de Cuba, como algunos entusiastas pretenden. De hecho, en las actuales negociaciones han estado presentes los intereses de los capitales y de los poderes, no así la frágil sociedad civil cubana, incluyendo en esta el siempre citado incipiente empresariado, surgido, según algunos analistas, a partir de la implementación de las llamadas reformas raulistas. A la vez, el marco legal, así como el estado de opinión que han estado creando los medios y no pocos especialistas, enmascara la realidad cubana, donde por más de medio siglo los ciudadanos han sido despojados de voz y de los derechos refrendados en los pactos contenidos en los organismos internacionales de los cuales nuestra nación es firmante. Todo esto refuerza la orfandad cívica de los cubanos, por supuesto, y la coyuntura es a la vez tentadora y peligrosa. Los cubanos comunes no hemos sido llamados a la mesa de diálogo, pero tenemos mucho en juego. La pregunta clave es, ¿qué será lo próximo en Cuba? Aquí y ahora podremos hacer miles de conjeturas e imaginar cualquier escenario. No obstante, ninguna apertura o reforma será efectiva ni legítima, en tanto no incluya las libertades de los cubanos como protagonistas verdaderos de las transformaciones que demanda Cuba, empezando por un diálogo nacional entre el gobierno y los gobernados. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Miriam. All right, so I will switch back to English. And this is a complicated presentation because I'm presenting on behalf of José Perelló, who is a professor at the University of Havana for tourism. And he had originally sent a paper earlier, like a month and a half ago, but then we started exchanging data. And I have Sebastián Acevedo here from the IMF who has helped on this. And Trevor Aline, also from the IMF, who went to Cuba and actually communicated with the professor. So this has become something beyond what he sent and includes all kinds of new data. So let's just call it a walk through the tourism data for Cuba and the broader Caribbean. And I should say that what's important to note and what's driving all of this interaction is that there is an organization, and I don't want to get this wrong, so it can be the Caribbean Tourism Organization or some other Caribbean-type organization that published a paper very, very recently critical of the U.S.-Cuba re-engagement because of its potential impact on the neighboring islands. And that is, in a sense, what is driving a lot of this work. So, once again, I will present José Perelló's work and also some of the work that I've been doing with Sebastián that I've been interacting with him on because of, as a reaction to this new, let's say, criticism of the potential risks that the Caribbean faces from a re-engagement of the United States and Cuba. I'm Rafael Romeo, president of DevTech Systems. So the first data that we see is through 2014, this is the composition of arrivals to Cuba. And what's important to note is that the dark blue, the regular blue, and the green are the United States, Canada, and Cuban Americans. And the smallest piece, the darkest one, is US residents. And I'm going to get into, even these numbers, I think, understate the presence of Americans in Cuba at this point. So the little piece at the bottom is Americans. And what you see is that Canadians, Americans, and Cuban Americans have now overtaken the rest of the world. I should be careful with the rest of the world because I'm going to use that as another category. Let's say all other countries, which would be the yellow part. We are now more than 50%, if you include Canada, of arrivals to Cuba in terms of tourism for the year 2014. Now in 2015, and these are data that just arrived, this is, I believe, through the 26th of July, ironically enough. The 2015 data show a very strong jump in tourism in Cuba. It's grown by 15% in the first half of this year versus the same period in 2014. And while you see a lot of growth in countries like Poland and Venezuela, the main jump has been large growth in the US. And we can look at it more usefully through what is called the contribution to growth, which means if you add the size of all of these bars, it adds up to 15%. And so how you arrived at 15% growth is Canada contributed 5.5 to 6%. The rest of the world, which is this very strange category, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is contributing about 1.5 to 2%. US is contributing 1.5 to 2%, and then Venezuela is contributing 1%. And CA, which is about a 0.5% growth, is Cuban Americans, just so you know the future. Now, what's interesting to note is when you look at all this list of countries, there's this category in Cuban statistics called the rest of the world that doesn't include any of these countries. And that category is essentially, I mean, I've argued this in the past, and I always talk about this with Perelló, and I don't know why he continues to go this direction, but that is Cuban Americans. Because when you go to Cuba, they don't know how to classify you if you're, for example, before 1971, but you come in with with an American passport because you left Cuba in the 60s, and so you're not, so it's very difficult for them to categorize these people, but there is a huge amount of people in Cuban tourist arrival statistics that are neither Americans, nor Cuban Americans, nor belong to any of these other countries, and they're huge. So that has to be Cubans that live somewhere else. For example, Spain or something. Now this is super interesting. So one of the things that Perelló will argue is that the tourism surge that's going on in Cuba right now is driving cultural tourism, and we'll get into that in a second. But basically, it's a better, higher value-added tourism for the Cuban economy because it doesn't necessarily mean just beach and sand and sort of the garrison tourism that you might see in other Caribbean islands where people are isolated behind walls in all-inclusive hotels. And so what he's showing here is the sequence in years of people who are staying overnight in private homes by province in Cuba, and then in Havana, which is the shaded area. Havana is so big that you have to break it out into 5 or 6 different areas. And so you see Plaza de la Revolución, Centro Habana, and Habana Vieja are the highest places where people stay overnight. And what you actually see is that they have, in Plaza de la Revolución, have declined a little bit, but everywhere else, this sort of the darker the red, the more recent the year. So 2014 would be the highest year for Centro Habana y Habana Vieja, and the second highest for Plaza de la Revolución. So the argument that he's trying to make is that people are staying more overnight. Nevertheless, this represents 20% of total U.S. arrivals. So 4 out of 5 people don't stay in private homes. They stay somewhere else. But, that's not bad. Now, Airbnb did a survey, or they commissioned a survey by an organization called YouGov, and this was some sort of a online survey asking Americans who are traveling to Cuba, why are you going? And one answer was architecture, the second was the local culture, the third was the beaches, and the fourth was the food. Problem is that they don't add up to 100, and I've looked and looked, and I still can't get them to break out the data. So I'm just going to go ahead and put what they put, which is that 28% of the people listed architecture and 30% and so on and so forth. It's about 120% of the people who were surveyed. So I don't know. But at least it's to some extent, let's say, comforting that these data show that it is not just the beach. So you may not see these figures in other Caribbean destinations, would be presumably the argument. So as I mentioned, Canada remains the largest share of arrivals to Cuba, and that is the problem, that this is what's driving the beach. They are indeed very, very large, and they represent, I think, maybe not 50, but 40% of all arrivals to Cuba at this point. But here again, you see, if you look down here, you see these are Cuban Americans, which is the second largest source of arrivals to Cuba. And this right here is the rest of the world, which probably is also Cuban Americans. So this bar should actually be somewhere around here. And then here's the United States with another 75,000 people. So then when you add it up, there's roughly, and this is the figure that I always cite, is roughly 400,000 to 500,000 people who are something like Americans going to Cuba. So yeah, I mean, it's something coming from here or places that look like here. And when you take Canada out, you really see this, the weight of the sort of diaspora, the Cuban diaspora. Now the question that I was alluding to earlier about the problem and the rest of the Caribbean is now bringing up has been raised, and this is where the discussions with Perelló are going at this point, have been raised as to what is the impact should Cuba normalize. And Perelló has argued in the past that there are 1 million Americans that could go to Cuba under kind of an open scenario. And that would be a very low number to my mind. It would be, but he is reflecting much stronger restrictions, I think, in his projections than what one might imagine would be a free and open flow of tourists to the U.S. And so one thing that has never been seen, at least that I have not seen, is what does Miami look like, and what would be the impact of Miami from an opening of travel. So this is what the United States, which is also a Caribbean destination, looks like. And you can see that 1 million tourists taken out of Miami they wouldn't all come from Miami, obviously, but some may, would not significantly impact, as Miami receives 6.5 million U.S. tourists. And this is, I believe, just Miami beaches. So I don't know if they're capturing fully Fort Lauderdale and the Palm Beaches, but what is super interesting to note is that Miami is a highly, highly competitive international destination. So this is an enormous set of numbers for any Caribbean. I'm sorry about the Skype here. I don't know what's going on. At least it's Skype and not something else. You're getting 600,000 Canadians. You're getting maybe 300,000 Germans, another 300,000 British. And what is important to note here is that would the United States go into Cuba with a large number of tourists, there is an elasticity to be measured for how many people that are traveling to Cuba now would leave because of the presence of Americans. So there is an elasticity that measures if you have, for example, Cancun, that's an 85% American destination, do the French want to go there? Do the Germans want to go there? Regardless of capacity. And here's what you see, is that indeed Cuba is one of the higher, this is statistically significant at the, it's not very big, but at the 1% level, better than 1%, so it's significant at all conventional levels. And you can see that there are many, many destinations that have very high sensitivity to U.S. presence. So if Americans come, everyone else leaves. Cuba's one of those. I mean, it's just, and it's not a size constraint, mind you, because you have very small destinations like Turks and Caicos, you have very big ones like Cuba and Cancun and so on. And so the important thing to note here, and this would be the message to really the broader community, is that this is not an Armageddon scenario or a disaster for the Caribbean, to the extent that if you have 3.5 or 3 million Cuban tourists in Cuba now, and you replace that with 3 million American tourists, those people would redistribute, and places like Miami that are good at attracting international tourists would probably gather a bunch of them. The problem is that if you're a small island and you're not good at attracting, or you're inefficient or whatever, that's the problem. So what are the conclusions? The conclusions are that Cuba is benefiting from a tourist surge. There's a lot, I mean, anything that gets you in the press as a tourism destination generally does well. This is huge news that the U.S. and Cuba are coming together, at least taking some steps. There's 15% surge in the first half. I can assure you that that's not normal for any tourism destination. It is driven by the United States, by Canada. I don't know if this is Canadians sort of trying to get in. I always hear people say, I got to get there before the Americans get there, which is always an interesting, and it's an interesting question. I always ask them if they're going to go to North Korea before the South Koreans get there. Then we're still unclear on the total arrivals of Cubans, because the Cuban statistics continue to have this enormous rest of the world category that doesn't include any of the countries you would think, like Mexico. You know, sometimes people say, well, what about Brazilian tourists? What about they're all in there. Cuba has very good statistics by country of origin, and you still have this enormous Cuban-American-sized, unexplained statistical aberration in the figures. The argument that Perelló makes about the private sector is fair enough, but it's still maybe 1 in 5 people that take full advantage of it, and that the real growth will come with the further opening, and that other destinations, including Miami, should look forward to complementing Havana to the extent that they're competitive. If you're not competitive, you have a broader problem, So that's all I have to say, and I will go back to my moderating role and turn to now our discussants, which are Ted Henkin and Gary Maybardick. Is he here?
Yeah, he was watching you in the audience like I was.
All right, good. And so thank you very much. And so the time has been well managed, I might say. So we have 5 minutes per discussant, and then we can turn to questions. So why don't we start with Ted?
All right, great. I was expecting to go second, so I just ate a piece of candy. So
You want Gary to go first?
yeah, let him go first because.
All right. Gary, Ted's got something in his mouth.
I already swallowed mine. Except I was planning to work from here, so. So give me half a second to reorganize my notes. Sorry.
All right, back to Ted. I know. I don't know. You guys are like.
All right, so I'm supposed to comment on Ernesto's and Luis' papers, and it provides a certain problem. They're both excellent economists and have both done excellent papers. I tend to agree with all their conclusions, and so I'm probably ought to sit down at this point. However, left in that situation, I can be a little picky, I guess, but that's what it is. So let me talk about Ernesto's paper first. First of all, you should all read it. It is an excellent paper. In particular, what it's good at is that it really covers the waterfront in a very concise, well-written manner. So if there's one paper you want to read just to give you an idea of some of the issues ahead, I think it's a very good paper. I certainly agree with many of his recommendations. Particularly, he has let the comparative advantage decide what Cuba will export and produce. No one, including economists, do very well about projecting such items, and to try to get into giving incentives just doesn't work very well. The exchange rate system. He talked a little bit about it here, but in his paper, he makes a very good discussion on the values of fixed versus the floating rate, and comes down assuming, arguing that the floating rate is best for Cuba, and I would agree with him, although I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. He mentions in his talk about the fear of hyperinflation, the fear of unifying exchange rates. That comes through in any conversation. We tend to say meeting as he did in Puerto Rico. You hear that over and over again. It reminds me of discussions I had 15 years ago in Cuba with Juan Triana and other Cuban economists. And when I discovered that they were very well-trained economists, and they understood the economic theory very well. But there was something in the pit of their stomach that was missing, or maybe it was fear. For a Western economist, it is very easy to say, well, this is what theory says, and this is what we should do. For a Cuban economist, it seems to me, there is a great feel of uncertainty, how things are going to work out, how things are going to progress. And I think that pervades the system, and I think it is a real issue as they move forward. And I'm sure it's even a greater issue in the government when you don't have as many well-trained economists. He mentioned subsidies, I've heard that too. The basic argument is some of these firms will not survive when you unify the exchange rates, and you can't afford that. One economist told me when I was there in Cuba last year, we can't afford to have some of these large companies go under. There's too much unemployment will be created, and pointed to Venezuela, right? Pointed to Venezuela and the problems there, and said basically we just can't, we have to avoid that at home. I didn't quite see the total logic, but it's clearly partly there. Foreign investment, very quickly, every Cuban economist you talk to is talking about it. They all believe it's absolutely necessary. They're all looking really towards large investments, as is the government. We've had other speakers talking about that. I would argue that not with the Cuban economists, but the government, the reason for interest in foreign investment is it's much easier to control. You saw that in Venezuela, too. Less fear of the large corporations than its own indigenous private sector. It's a matter of control. But it's wrong. I don't think that Cuba is going to get the large foreign investment it hopes for anytime soon. And it needs a lot more indigenous growth, and a lot of it is happening now in the small firms. And I think they need to take that into account as they move ahead. Louise's paper has pretty much the same conclusions as Ernesto's into measures that need to be taken. I have very little to say here. He talks about remittances. He talks about tourism increasing by, by 400% by 2016. I'm not quite so optimistic about that, but something that I think both papers could move forward and talk a little bit more about. It's not just the number of tourists, it is the revenue that they generate. There is a capacity constraint in Cuba, which may limit some tourism, but a lot of the tourism in Cuba has traditionally had a very low rate of return to the corporations or the government. With supply and demand, with a much more increased demand for tourism, I think you might see revenues going up much more quickly, actually, than numbers of tourists. One comment I'll quickly make to Luis's paper, he talks about U.S. export, but if you look at his paper, his U.S. exports to Cuba are much smaller than the remittances in kind. And I think that needs to be taken into account. If you go through Havana airport and you see the boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff being imported from the U.S., including everything from tools to material and so on, I suspect the U.S. exports to Cuba are already several times of what is reported in the data. So all in all, I don't have much more to say, and I'm running out of time. Very good papers, and it was a pleasure to read them both.
All right, thank you very much, Gary. Next up is Ted Henkin from Baruch College to comment on Miriam Celaya and José Perelló.
Bueno, primero voy a comentar en el trabajo de Miriam Celaya en español y después cambio al inglés a comentar sobre la presentación del trabajo de Perelló por Rafael. Para resumir el argumento que yo entiendo que ha hecho Miriam, diría que Obama está tocando, pero Raúl va a abrir la puerta. En otras palabras, como dijo Raúl mismo en la Cumbre de las Américas, hay que tener mucha paciencia. Y él lo dijo 2 veces, mucha paciencia. Entonces, Obama ha reaccionado rápido y ha implementado cambios significativos que están bajo su alcance de poder como presidente de Estados Unidos. Obviamente que el embargo no está bajo su control, pero su reacción después del 17 de diciembre ha sido rápido y ya tenemos embajadas, pero antes de eso cambió muchas de las regulaciones y restricciones. Como hemos oído hoy por la mañana y otra vez en la presentación de Miriam, bueno, la pelota ahora está en la cancha de Cuba y cómo va a reaccionar, qué va a hacer. Han hecho algo, pero no han hecho suficiente, de acuerdo con la presentación de ella. En otras palabras, ella está planteando, creo yo, que bueno, está bien que Cuba y Estados Unidos hablen entre gobiernos diplomáticamente con respeto mutuo, pero cuando el gobierno cubano va a escuchar con respeto a las opiniones y a veces que son opiniones bastante críticas de los mismos cubanos como ciudadanos y darles derechos como entes económicos para invertir y participar en los cambios y no solo estar ahí como sobrevivientes o observadores de estos cambios. Ella también habló de los cambios en el trabajo por cuenta propia, como son cambios cuantitativos, pero hasta ahora, a su juicio, no cualitativos, porque la gran mayoría de los trabajos son trabajos de sobrevivencia y no de producción ni que producen trabajos. También tocó el tema de las cooperativas. En el trabajo, en el libro que hizo Arch y yo sobre el trabajo por cuenta propia, el sector privado cubano, tenemos un capítulo que habla de la potencialidad del sector cooperativa, pero nos sorprendió, o me sorprendió a mí hace poco, y Miriam habló de eso, de la declaración reciente de que en Cuba no quieren masificar las cooperativas. Entonces, ¿qué van a masificar? Porque es obvio que el trabajo por cuenta propia ya ha crecido, pero hasta que hagan otros cambios significativos no va a crecer más. No permiten mayormente profesionales entrar en este sector. Yo tenía la idea de que Cuba como gobierno preferiría abrir el sector cooperativa, pero parece que no quieren masificar eso tampoco. Solo termino mi comentario sobre Miriam con una sugerencia o un poco de propaganda. Mañana, hoy por la tarde, a las 4:30, hay un panel sobre el sector privado emergente en Cuba y hay un par de trabajos de cubanos que vienen de la isla, Carlos Fernández Aballí y Roberto González Perelló. Y los dos, uno es un fundador de una cooperativa en Cuba que actualmente existe y nos va a hablar sobre sus experiencias en tratar de hacer un startup, primero en el trabajo por cuenta propia y ahora como cooperativista. Termino ahora con mis comentarios breves sobre el trabajo de Perelló y el aporte y lo que ha agregado Rafael, y cambio al inglés. In terms of the numbers and in terms of the investigation that Rafael presented, the numbers since the last 6 months are quite startling. 15% growth, and the growth in the sector of the United States visitors is 50% growth. Now the numbers are still relatively small relative to Canada, which is the elephant in Cuba's living room. In terms of the numbers of tourists, it's still way beyond any other group. But I think that Rafael's point about adding together or aggregating the different streams, non-Cuban Americans, Cuban Americans, and this other interesting statistical creation, which is rest of the world, would actually start to compete numerically with Canada. And it would be interesting to investigate that further. So I hope that you guys, either together or separately, come up with an explanation for this rest of the world, because I don't think the Burundis and the Saudi Arabias of the world are adding up to that number, right? Because the numbers that they report are the top 20. And then supposedly the rest of the world is made up of every other country in the rest of the world. But the numbers for the last one of the 20 is still so low that how could the rest of the world really be contributing this? So I agree with that. I disagree, and I'll end on a note of disagreement to provoke Rafael, is that the 20% of people staying in private homes is not significant. I think that's hugely significant given the slings and arrows that the private sector, especially the self-employed sector and the tourism sector, have had to endure. There seems to be a change of mentality on the part of the Cuban government from, in the old days, trying to shut down most of these self-employed workers to now relying on them because the government realizes that if they don't create rooms or allow the private sector to create rooms for tourists to stay in, less tourists will come. So it's kind of a win-win. Obviously, Airbnb took advantage of that, piggybacked on it, and has built their business model in Cuba on, on that idea. So I think that 20% is significant, especially given that they've been building hotel rooms in Cuba like crazy for the last 20 years, and they're still far from prepared, and now they're relying on the private sector, and even allowing tour companies, government tour companies, to house people in private homes and take people to private restaurants for dinner and lunch. And so there's been a slight change in mentality, but it's not a philosophical change. It's a change motivated by the Yankee dollar, right? By hard currency, because there's more hard currency coming in if you allow to collaborate with the private sector than demonize or outlaw the private sector. So I'll end there and look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Ted. I think we can take some questions from the audience and then let people respond broadly to those, as well as the discussants' questions. We have about 15 minutes.
All right, why don't we start here with...
Thank you. My name is Luis Martinez Fernandez. My name is Luis Martinez Fernandez. I'm a professor of history at University of Central Florida. Mi pregunta va dirigida a Miriam en cuanto a la... O sea, entendemos que uno de los fundamentos de la democracia es una prensa libre, algo que en Cuba no existe. Me refiero a... La pregunta puntualmente tiene que ver con, en un futuro, cuando se vayan abriendo las cosas en esa área tan importante como es la prensa, ¿quiénes van a jugar esos roles? ¿Serán los periodistas independientes que están batallando? ¿Será alguna de las personas que son periodistas, aunque no hacen función periodística? ¿O será gente del exterior? O sea, ¿cuáles son los que van a jugar ese papel?
Sobre ese aspecto solo podríamos especular. Yo pienso, y esta es una opinión muy individual, yo pienso que ese rol lo van a jugar muchas personas, porque en este momento, afortunadamente, aunque existe un monopolio de prensa, en efecto, paralelamente se han ido desarrollando en los últimos años la prensa alternativa. Hay mucha prensa independiente en Cuba, hay muchísimos periodistas independientes en Cuba. O sea, ahora hay un periodismo que es prácticamente invisible para los cubanos al interior por la baja conectividad que hay, pero sí existen muchos periodistas independientes, hay muchos blogs, todos los blogs no son opositores, todos no son disidentes, o sea que hay una variedad grande, un diapasón bien amplio de opiniones y de tendencias y de información también. Existe, ya sabemos, 14 y medio, que ya tiene un año de fundado, me parece que va a jugar un papel importante. Es un proyecto que cuenta con mucho apoyo al interior de Cuba también de colaboradores y ha creado redes bastante fuertes de colaboradores y reporteros en prácticamente todas las provincias. Está la revista Convivencia y hay muchísimos más. No quisiera hacer un listado porque siempre pecamos de dejar a alguien fuera y no quiero ofender, ¿no? Pero yo sí creo que eso existe ya y creo que también en un futuro va a haber espacios donde estén los que hoy vemos en el periodismo oficial y también van a jugar un papel. Yo creo que el criterio nuestro es la inclusión, pero cómo será no sabemos. Lo que sí estamos seguros es que el gobierno va a ralentizar todo lo posible el momento en que haya prensa libre en Cuba.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Otra propaganda, que hay un panel sobre Internet en Cuba mañana y se va a hablar un poco sobre la prensa independiente, emergente en la blogosfera y también digitalizado. Okay?
Thanks, Ted. I was intrigued by Gary's comment, also Ernesto's, on the desire of Cuban economists, if not the Cuban authorities, of a slow, smooth unification of the exchange rate. I was thinking of Franco's Spain in the 50s, 60s, the Chilean, et cetera. I wonder, taking advantage of the three financial gurus on the panel, can they think of any case in which there has been, with the disparity we know exists now in Cuba, a smooth transition to a unified exchange rate?
I don't think so. The problem with gradualism, especially in the financial area, but in general, is that you give the opposition a chance to organize. If you cut the cat's tail in one installment, as one of our friends in Bolivia, who's no longer in Bolivia, used to say, the suffering is diminished and you don't get the cat screaming at you and revolting. I think that's partly what's going on in Cuba right now. The other thing is what I mentioned as the diffuse fear that the world will come to an end, which of course is counterfactual. If you look at the experience of all the countries in Eastern Europe, even in the former Soviet Union, that have gone through devaluation, and outside the former Soviet Union. The devaluations that occurred after the Asian crisis, the Mexican crisis, etc. What they did, as somebody mentioned this morning, is to, Carlos I think, is to make exports more competitive and import competing industries less competitive. And that's what the doctor ordered. So I will keep trying to convince Domingo and others that this has to be done. And it has to be done rapidly, and I think there are people in Cuba who agree with me.
Roger Betancourt, University of Maryland. My question is for Rafael. In these figures about the tourists staying at hotels and all that, is there a differentiation between Cuban Americans that stay with their families but not paying as part of the process? Is there any data on that?
I don't know. I think this is people paying. So Cuban Americans that stay with their families are not in that 1 in 5. And by the way, I'll take the opportunity to say to Ted that I think he's right, that the 1 in 5 is significant given the amount of work that you have to go through and the tax rates and so on to run a business. But it's still 4 out of 5 are not going there. So, you know, the mass of revenue is not passing through that part. But no, it doesn't include. Yeah, because they'll get them at the airport, but then when they go in, you don't see them registered in a private sanctioned overnight.
It's rare that Rafael tells me I'm right, so I'll just listen to the first half of his thing.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Sterling from the University of Glasgow. When compared to other Caribbean destinations such as the Bahamas, Cuba does not have a significant tourist infrastructure. So what are they going to have to do, the government, to incentivize places like Hilton or Carnival cruise ships to invest and build major tourist developments to promote tourism as a major industry in Cuba?
Well, I'd like to take that answer to that one. The government needs to get out of the way.
No, but just a second. Cuba has an enormous, it doesn't have major developments in perhaps some traditional senses of what the United States might have, but it has maybe 80,000 rooms in Varadero. It has another complex in Jardín de Reyes, which is the Cayo Coco complex. There's obviously an enormous amount of infrastructure in Havana. The American hotels aren't there, but the Spanish and the French and so on have been there for maybe 20 years. So there is a lot of sort of excess capacity that needs to be updated for sure. So I take your point, but not necessarily. They're not starting from scratch, and there are 3 million plus arrivals destination at this point. So they rival Dominican Republic in that sense.
Did you say 80,000 rooms in Varadero?
Yeah, something 60 to 80,000. Perelló, maybe the Varadero. I have the, I'll send you the number.
Okay, anyone else want to ask a question, lodge a complaint, file a grievance?
I have a question for Gary, but before I give the question, Rafael, I don't know where you got that number. And the entire hotel industry in Cuba has about 32,000 rooms, and there's other developments taking place, but I don't know where that came from.
I'm looking up the number right now.
But my question is for Gary primarily.
I got it on my phone.
Gary mentioned that he doesn't think that Cuba will get the large foreign investments, and that therefore the development needs to take place through the development of the small business. I also don't understand where that thinking comes from. Just right now, there are 13 Spanish hotel companies negotiating with the Cuban government on development of hotels. The country of Qatar alone has 2 projects over $100 million that they're negotiating with the Cuban government, not counting the American companies and the interest in the limestone, the hotel, the nickel industry, each of which will be in the $200 to $300 million investment category. So I don't know. So perhaps
right.
he can enlighten me as to why he thinks that.
Let me clarify the figure exactly. So I have a table from Perelló, Habitaciones Físicas de Cuba por Provincia. And what he does is he breaks it down by company, Gaviota, Gran Caribe, Cubanacan, et cetera, and it totals 80,832 rooms. Now that's the number I have. No, it is, no, you're right. Varadero is, okay, I misspoke. So I made a mistake.
But there's still a big difference. But there's still a big difference between 32,000 and 80,000. So we still have a research question to answer.
Yeah.
All right, Domingo, did you want to ask a question?
No, I have to answer.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I agree. I think there will be a considerable amount of foreign investment in hotels and so on. I don't disagree with that at all. My comment really comes out of the Cuban hopes for Mariel and a special economic zone in manufacturing and so on. And that's where I don't see the investment coming. So I really should have been more careful in my statement. I don't see many advantages in manufacturing in Cuba that you don't already have in Central America, Mexico, and a lot of other places. Especially given the way in which they conduct wages and what they charge foreign companies for wages, as Jorge Perez Lopez has written about very, very well. I have a feeling that zone, despite the large number of applications that have gone to it, will turn out to be very much like the previous attempt at special economic zones, which failed rather miserably. I think an economy, though, to grow needs more than a few enclaves. Ernesto used the term enclaves in his paper. Maybe it's Louise. It needs the kind of indigenous growth throughout the country. I mean, it's little things. When I was there 16 years ago, you could not find a hardware store. This last time, when I was there last year, I found one. Without that, you can't build, you can't get the lumber. You have a lot of supplementary industries. And some of those that are developing are being financed by these remittances in kind I talked about. They're getting their machinery, their tools, and so on that way. And I think that's probably a much more important investment than generally realized. So yes, hotels, yes, there's going to be a lot more foreign investment. Nickel, maybe. I don't know. If it's opened up to American oil companies, maybe you'll see something there. But I think it depends a lot more on indigenous growth. Let me ask a point.
Sure. We'll do this, and then we'll have one more question for the break.
Just a point on tourism investment is that the existing tourism investments by Meliá, Barcelona, Spanish companies, and others are just management contracts. They don't have any assets in Cuba. And the reason is U.S. legislation. So essentially, the capital is really owned by the Cubans, but Meliá has essentially a management contract. They get 1% or between 1% and 2%. So essentially, when they lift the restrictions, there'll be a huge surge in investment because then they can have the assets in Cuba.
Domingo?
If we're throwing a few numbers here, the information that I have concerning rooms, the tourist industry, state tourist industry, has so far something like 67,000 rooms.
50 or 67?
67,000. Out of that, 80%, 4-5 stars. By 2020, there should be 85,000 rooms. The other thing is that the private sector has officially registered 18,000 rooms, officially registered. Now, how many hotels are equivalent to 18,000 rooms officially registered? And I'm saying officially registered because we all know that behind every room that is registered, probably, most certainly, there's another one or a second one just, on the table. Okay? That's it.
All right, any responses to that, or we can close with those wise words?
Well, I'd just like to say that, again, from my own experience, back in 97, 99, when we already began to have private rooms, it was pretty primitive. And you go today, when my last trip, where I stayed only at Casa Particulares, they were very nice. They've really been upgraded, and it's actually, I would recommend anybody going to Cuba to stay in a Casa Particulares.
How much did you pay per night?
Around $40, and that usually included breakfast.
All right. One last comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, let me explain myself. Oh, yes, you were holding it. I'm very well aware of the situation in the tourist industry, hotels, accommodations, private homes, and so forth in Cuba. Let me just to clarify to all of you, I am an architect, and I know what it takes to restore those existing hotels that they are doing it and so forth. On the other side, my father designed and built the famous hotel motel in Viñales, and that was done in 1959. That hotel is still standing up. I had some damage because of some of the hurricanes threw a tree or something on falling one corner, La Terraza. And it's well built. That is not happening anymore. I mean, that's what buildings are collapsing. They are not being maintained. And for me, every time I have been able to go to Cuba, after 46, they didn't allow me to go. I have been 5 times, I think. And to see that the buildings are getting just damaged and falling down because of lack of maintenance. I stay in private rooms, in private hotels and so forth, houses and persons in Trinidad and in Santi Espiritu stay also. And yes, they have been upgraded with money sent by the remisas. And they are being used that way, so it's a good use of that money, because now they are creating income for the families that they have in Cuba when you send money in that regard. And I don't know if anybody has any other question for me, but that is my statement.
Well, we have a long launch ahead of us, so people who have interest to follow up with people individually. We'll see you guys back after lunch.
Thank you.